In terms of land area, Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world and ranks seventh globally in population size. However, a notable demographic paradox is that the majority of Brazilians reside within a mere 80-kilometer radius of the extensive coastline, while many assume that the Amazon rainforest is the primary reason for this distribution. This massive ecological region does not occupy as much of Brazil's territory as commonly believed. The question then arises as to why a larger proportion of the Brazilian population does not choose to inhabit the interior regions of the country. To understand this, one must recognize that while Brazil is a vast nation today, its historical formation did not begin with the establishment of the modern state. The roots of its demographic distribution trace back long before the arrival of Europeans, beginning with the indigenous populations who inhabited the land for millennia. Contrary to the widespread historical misconception that the New World was largely an untouched wilderness, thousands of indigenous groups, such as the Tupi, Guarani, and Yanomami, had developed complex societies within the territory we now know as Brazil. Each of these distinct communities possessed its own traditions, languages, and deep ecological relationships with the land. As recently as 2007, estimates still recorded approximately 67 uncontacted tribes living in isolation within the country, although this figure has likely fluctuated in recent years. Despite the millennia-long stewardship of this territory by indigenous groups, the historical trajectory of Brazil fundamentally shifted in the early 16th century with the arrival of Portuguese explorers led by Pedro Álvares Cabral. European colonizers were primarily driven by the region's economic potential, particularly the lucrative trade in Brazil wood, from which the nation likely derives its name. The Portuguese claim over Brazil as a colony and their subsequent resource extraction triggered a wave of conflicts and transformations that entirely restructured the region. From a demographic history perspective, indigenous populations suffered catastrophic losses during the colonial era, facing introduced diseases, forced labor, and territorial displacement. As Portuguese economic interests expanded into large-scale sugar plantations, the demand for manual labor surged dramatically. When the indigenous workforce proved insufficient, the colonizers turned to the transatlantic slave trade, importing millions of Africans to Brazil under brutal conditions. This forced convergence of indigenous, European, and African cultures generated a complex social fabric that constitutes the unique Brazilian identity present today. Over time, other European powers also attempted to assert geopolitical influence in Brazil, resulting in complex territorial disputes, most notably with Spain, which claimed vast portions of Central and South America. These geopolitical tensions were formally addressed by the Treaty of Tordesillas, under which Pope Alexander VI established a meridian line decreeing that lands to the east belonged to Portugal and lands to the west to Spain. However, the demarcation line drawn on the maps of that era was rudimentary and lacked geographic precision. This cartographic imprecision inadvertently laid the foundation for the modern borders between the former Portuguese and Spanish colonies in South America. This historical decree is the core reason why Portuguese is the dominant language in Brazil, whereas Spanish is spoken across most of the remaining South American nations. Entering the early 19th century, Brazil began its transition toward becoming an independent nation, gradually developing its own identity, culture, and autonomous economy. Facing military threats from Napoleon in Europe, the Portuguese royal family relocated its court to the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro in 1808, remaining there for the next 15 years. Consistent with broader trends across the Western Hemisphere, the ideological currents of the Enlightenment and revolutionary movements quickly permeated Brazilian society. Consequently, in 1822, Dom Pedro I, the son of the Portuguese king, officially declared Brazil's independence and was crowned its first emperor. This period marked a systemic institutional transition from a colonial territory to an independent empire, ultimately culminating in the establishment of a republic in 1889. Throughout this developmental timeline, the nation continued to grapple with deep-seated social and economic inequalities, a direct systemic legacy of its colonial past. In the post-independence era, Brazil's political economy underwent a series of macroeconomic restructurings. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, The national economic strategy shifted focus from agriculture to industrialization, acting as a powerful catalyst for urbanization in centers like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Politically, Brazil's 20th century was characterized by alternating periods of democratic governance interrupted by military dictatorships. Despite ongoing systemic challenges such as social inequality, corruption, and environmental degradation in the Amazon basin, contemporary Brazil has emerged as a crucial geopolitical player on the global stage. It is evident that Brazil's historical record is highly complex and cannot be comprehensively summarized in a few brief analytical points. However, intricately woven into this rich history are the macro-geographical characteristics of the nation, which have profoundly influenced its developmental trajectory. Brazil is a massive geographical entity that dominates the South American landscape in both total landmass and topographical diversity, spanning approximately 8.5 million square kilometers. It is the fifth largest nation globally, only marginally smaller than China at 9.3 million and the United States at 9 million square kilometers. Distributed across this vast territory is a highly complex and fragmented geographical ecosystem. The Amazon rainforest is undoubtedly the most globally recognized geographic feature of the nation. As the world's largest tropical rainforest, this biome serves as a repository for an extraordinary level of biodiversity, spatial analysis reveals. However, that the Amazon rainforest only accounts for approximately 47% of Brazil's total area, or about 3.9 million square kilometers, despite often being conflated with the entire country. The majority of this forest cover is concentrated in the extreme northwestern region and plays a critical role in global carbon sequestration. Frequently earning it the designation of the Earth's green lung, the region's hydrological network is dominated by the Amazon River and its tributaries, creating a complex flow system that sustains countless plant and animal species. Hydrological data indicates that the Amazon River possesses an average discharge rate of approximately 224,000 cubic meters per second, vastly exceeding any other river system worldwide. For comparative scale, the world's second-largest river by discharge, the Meghna in Bangladesh, records an average flow of only 44,000 cubic meters per second. In stark contrast to the dense vegetation of the Amazon, northeastern Brazil is characterized by the Caatinga biome. Noted for its scrubby vegetation and arid climate, this ecological zone is currently confronting severe environmental challenges, including desertification and acute water scarcity. A significant ecological distinction of the Caatinga is that it is the only biome exclusively endemic to Brazil, meaning the vast majority of its biological heritage exists nowhere else on Earth. Moving southward, the central region of Brazil is dominated by the Cerrado, a highly biodiverse tropical savanna ecosystem that is increasingly threatened by agricultural expansion. This ecological threat is primarily driven by the cattle ranching sector as the demand for grazing land continues to escalate. Running along the southeastern coast is the Atlantic forest, an area that has experienced substantial spatial reduction due to aggressive logging for urban development and agriculture. Despite its significantly diminished territorial scale, the Atlantic forest maintains its classification as a global biodiversity hotspot. In the southwestern region, the Pantanal represents another critical geographical feature of the Brazilian landscape. Recognized as the world's largest tropical wetland, this area sustains a dense population of wildlife, including jaguars, caimans, and highly diverse avian communities. The Pantanal simultaneously functions as a strategic regional reservoir for freshwater resources.
According to the annual hydrological cycle, approximately 80% of the Pantanal's floodplains are submerged underwater during the rainy season. Finally, the nation's peripheral geography is defined by an extensive coastline stretching over 4,300 miles. While this coastal structure offers a variety of landscapes, it is predominantly recognized for dynamic urban growth poles like Rio de Janeiro and its iconic beach systems. The São Paulo metropolitan area, though not situated directly on the oceanfront, is located a mere 30 miles inland. It is analytically clear that Brazil's geographic foundation is highly layered and spans a colossal spatial scale, despite the immense availability of land. The spatial distribution of the population is highly concentrated, with the vast majority residing within a 50-mile radius of the coast. Even when living outside the rainforest biome, population density mapping reveals an extreme concentration along the expansive coastline that borders the Atlantic Ocean for over 6,900 kilometers. Demographic statistics confirm that more than half of the national population resides within just 80 kilometers of the coast, a phenomenon governed by an intersection of historical, economic, and climatic variables. Historical analysis indicates that this concentrated settlement pattern originates directly from Brazil's colonial era, upon their arrival in the early 16th century. Portuguese explorers established coastal settlements to optimize the logistical networks required for exporting sugar and Brazil wood to European markets. These initial coastal colonial nodes served as the foundational infrastructure for modern megacities like São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, centers that continue to sustain growth momentum and attract domestic migration. From a macroeconomic perspective, the coastal belt has historically functioned as the core engine of the nation's economic structure. This zone houses critical maritime port infrastructure, operating as strategic commercial gateways for import and export flows. Industrial ecosystems organically developed around these port clusters, creating economic hubs capable of providing mass employment and stimulating labor migration. Consistent with global urban development models, port cities consistently experience rapid expansion due to the gravitational pull of their labor markets. In this spatial economic aspect, Brazil's developmental trajectory does not deviate significantly from other coastal nations. However, a variable that arguably overrides economic factors is that coastal zones possess vastly milder microclimates compared to the interior, significantly enhancing their residential appeal. Because the majority of the territory lies within the tropics, moving just a few kilometers inland from the coast results in a drastic escalation of temperature and humidity levels. Conversely, maritime air masses exert a strong moderating influence on meteorological conditions across the coastal plains. This thermal contrast clearly illustrates the fundamental difference between continental and maritime climate typologies. Throughout the historical development timeline, particularly before the advent of modern air conditioning technology, settling near the ocean provided a biological comfort that the interior simply could not offer. Statistical analysis shows that over 107 million of Brazil's 217 million citizens live almost directly on the coast. Of those, approximately 22 million are concentrated in São Paulo, 13 million in Rio de Janeiro, 4.3 million in Porto Alegre, 4.1 million in Fortaleza, 4 million in Recife, 4 million in Salvador, and 3.6 million in Curitiba. In contrast, demographic data for the interior region only highlights major urban centers such as Belo Horizonte with 6 million residents, the capital Brasilia with 4.6 million, and Manaus with 2.7 million. The municipality of Manaus presents a particularly notable case study due to its geographically isolated position squarely in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. Historical records indicate that Manaus was originally established in 1669 as a Portuguese military outpost deep within the Amazon. Despite its centuries-old origins, this settlement experienced a prolonged developmental lag before accumulating the necessary conditions to transform into a functional urban structure. Manaus only began to assert its geo-economic significance during the late 19th century global rubber boom, positioning itself as a symbol of rapid wealth accumulation and prosperity. The magnificent Amazon Theater, an opera house from that era, remains physically intact today as material evidence of the luxurious lifestyle once present there and continues to serve as a core tourism anchor. The subsequent collapse of the domestic rubber supply chain triggered a severe cyclical economic depression, leaving the city stagnant for roughly 50 years before recovering its demographic growth momentum. A pivotal policy shift occurred in 1967 with the establishment of a free trade zone, which catalyzed investment flows from domestic and international corporations, restructuring Manaus into a major industrial hub. Exemplifying the success of this policy is the presence of global telecommunications and electronics conglomerates such as LG, Nokia, Samsung, Siemens, and Bank, which operate direct manufacturing facilities within the city. Despite possessing an industrial economic structure typically associated with coastal development poles, Manaus remains entirely physically encompassed by the Amazon rainforest, functioning as the ecological transit hub. For this massive territory, From an ecotourism infrastructure perspective, this city serves as the strategic departure point for deep jungle expeditions, catering to consumer demographics seeking to explore the diverse Amazonian ecosystem. In parallel, the network of research institutes and higher education facilities in Manaus maintains a pioneering position in tropical ecology analysis, climate change monitoring, and nature conservation policy planning. Logistically, its adjacency to the Amazon River has transformed Manaus into a vital transportation node, optimizing the circulation of goods and passengers in a region where deploying terrestrial road infrastructure faces severe technical barriers. The Port of Manaus is currently ranked among the highest volume inland ports globally, functioning to integrate remote areas of the Amazon basin with national and international economic networks, assessing spatial accessibility. Fluvial or aerial transport remain virtually the only viable logistical solutions for traveling from other parts of the nation to Manaus. Although Brazil's Route 319 covers a significant portion of the terrestrial journey, motorized vehicles are still mandated to utilize ferry services to bridge the gap created by the massive Amazon River. The terrestrial transportation network indicates that Boa Vista is the only large-scale Brazilian municipality possessing a direct overland connection to Manaus. Current demographic databases show Manaus with a population of approximately 2.7 million, confirming its status as the largest urban center located entirely within the core of the Amazon rainforest. Subsequent positions in this regional urban hierarchy belong to Belém with an estimated population of 2.2 million and Boa Vista with roughly 420,000 residents. In synthesis, this analytical report confirms that Brazil is a nation possessing a highly complex socio-geographical structure that extends far beyond the common stereotype linking it solely to the Amazon rainforest. The pronounced concentration of the population along the coastal zones represents a scientifically rational settlement model, emerging from an optimal intersection of geo-economic advantages and highly favorable microclimates for human habitation. This concludes the in-depth analytical briefing on the geographical and demographic characteristics of Brazil. Thank you for your attention to this report.